Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It is my pleasure to welcome you to Instituto Cervantes, London. As some of you may know, we have recently launched the Blanco White series as a means to celebrate those characters and moments in history that reflect British-Spanish bonds. And today's lecture serves this purpose by focusing in a public intellectual, Ramiro de Maeztu, whose views and opinions were shaped to a great extent by his first-hand knowledge of British culture and politics. Largely a forgotten figure for many years, Maeztu remains to this day a controversial thinker in 20th century Spain, and with good reason. There are progressive writers and there are reactionary writers, but there are not many that have been called progressive as well as reactionary, as well as Maeztu's case. Born in the Basque Country, a cradle of Spanish Anglophilia, it is no wonder that Maeztu felt an attraction, a complex attraction, but an attraction after all, for all things British. And he has undoubtedly left a mark in British-Spanish relations, being as he was our first correspondent in the UK. Based in London during the Edwardian years up till 1920, Maeztu witnessed some of the key transformations of the modern that took place during the era, from the beginnings of the modern welfare state to the First World War, of the struggle for women's suffrage. His articles in the press became the conduit through which an eager Spanish audience learned of the joys and griefs of the Britons of the time. Maeztu's own ideas would be strongly influenced by the great Edwardian authors he met in London, such as Chesterton and Shaw. Yet his feeling towards his host country always remained ambivalent, an attitude which continued after his return to Spain and which in some ways shaped his entire intellectual trajectory, as we have said before. Maeztu is therefore a fascinating case study of the dynamics of modern Spanish Anglophilia, and a good example of the intensely complicated relationship which continental authors have had with the UK. An Anglophile himself, and one of Spain's brightest young scholars, Dr. David Jiménez Torres, has written extensively on Spanish-English cultural transfers, and he is the author of the recently published Ramiro de Maeztu in England, Imaginaries, Realities, and Repercussions of a Cultural Encounter. David, who is well known among Spanish readers for his columns in El Español, obtained his PhD from the University of Cambridge and was lecturer in contemporary Spanish cultural studies at the University of Manchester. He is currently associate lecturer in humanities at the Universidad Camilo José Cela in Madrid. And I have some news to disclose about our speaker today. He's publishing his first novel, Cambridge en mitad de la noche, Cambridge in the middle of the night, this month. It is, from its very title, a very English novel, so if there are any translators in here, please do not hesitate and rush to the library to find a book and get it translated as soon as possible into English. And that's all from me, and now David Jiménez Torres takes the floor. Thank you very much for coming, and I hope you'll enjoy the lecture.
So good afternoon. Thank you all very much for being here. Thank you very much, Ignacio, for the invitation. Thank you to the Instituto Cervantes for inviting me and for giving me this opportunity to discuss some of my research in this great city and in this great institution. It's really a joy to be back in London. So, as Ignacio very kindly explained in the introduction, my talk today is going to focus on the Spanish journalist, essayist, and political thinker Ramiro de Maeztu. As he is not a very universally known figure, I'm going to start by explaining a few things about his life and his links to the UK. Then I will look at some of the things he wrote about this country when he was living here and working here. And I'm going to finish by drawing some conclusions about what he can teach us about Spanish and continental Anglophiles. And also about really the relationships that we forge with other nations. By the way, I'm also used to lecturing for audiences of 18-year-olds who it's when there's no PowerPoint behind you, like you tend to see them their eyes like kind of wander towards their mobiles within like 5 to 10 minutes. So I'm used to it. I won't feel bad if I see you doing the same.
Thank you.
Who was Maeztu, and why is he worth your attention this afternoon? Maeztu lived in the final decades of the 19th century and the first ones of the 20th. And in 1905, which is really the key date for the purposes of our talk, he became the first foreign correspondent for the Spanish press to have been based in London. So prior to him, Spanish foreign correspondents were usually based in Paris. Paris was, of course, the nexus of European communications. French was a language most commonly spoken by Spanish elites and really by elites throughout the continent. And so, before Maeztu, Spanish accounts of Britain were usually the work of travelers or of writers who spent stints of time in this country, or also of the numerous political exiles who ended up in London throughout Spain's very tumultuous 19th century. So Maeztu was sort of in contrast with all those figures who had come before him, the first major figure who was sent here to report, and to report on a near daily basis on the comings and goings of British society for a Spanish audience. He arrived here when he was relatively young. He had just turned 30, but he was already quite well known in Spanish intellectual circles. He sort of achieved a name for himself as one of the most talented of a young generation of Spanish intellectuals who were very marked by the collapse of Spain's overseas empire. As you may know, in 1898, Spain has this very brief war with the United States, loses some of its historic colonies in the Caribbean, and there's this sort of moment of national consternation and also this desire to regenerate national life. Maeztu's first book, which was an essay entitled Hacia otra España, Towards Another Spain, captured this curious blend of socialism, Europeanism, and Nietzschean philosophy that was espoused by the young intelligentsia at the turn of the century. And moving to London made sense for Maeztu for a number of reasons. He was half British on his mother's side, although she herself seems to have been a bit estranged from her home country, and we have no news that Maeztu had ever actually been to the UK prior to his being posted here. In fact, he wrote a letter to his sister in 1908 where he said that his first year in London he had struggled quite strongly to be an effective reporter, because even though he could read English perfectly, he had never really heard it spoken. So he would go to political rallies or to mass meetings and he had no idea what people were saying. But beyond sort of biographical reasons, really the principal motive for his interest in London seems to have been of an intellectual or a political nature. The young Maeztu advocated that Spain embrace the processes of modernity, and of course modernity means lots of different things to different people. For him it meant mostly two. Number one, modernizing the state in order to facilitate industrialization. So he thought that one of the things that Spain needed was to become more effectively industrialized. And number two, fostering a much more robust workers' movement, a much more robust workers' culture. And following the racialist discourse of the time, he often, again prior to coming here, recommended that Spain adopt the mindset and the values, or the supposed mindset and values of Anglo-Saxon culture, which of course was this term that was bandied about at the time, and really to a certain extent still, that kind of conflates the UK and the United States, this sense that though they're different countries, they share a similar culture, and one of the things that one does show some things about the other, and vice versa. And of course, Maeztu wasn't the only one putting forward this type of argument. In the final decade of the 19th century, a very large section of the Spanish public had developed a keen interest in the ideas and the processes which could be found in other Western European nations. Again, we will go back to the loss of the country's overseas colonies, which had been seen by many as a demonstration that the country was painfully out of step with modernity, and needed to learn from more developed nations about how to thrive in the modern world. So in this sense, Maeztu being posted here is already in itself symptomatic. It's a symptom of this kind of cultural hunger in the Spain of his time. Well, he was initially meant to stay for just a couple of months. At least we have some indication that it was originally going to be a very brief posting. His articles were popular enough, and he was satisfied enough with his new setting that he ended up remaining for 15 years. So that's between 1905 and 1919. And his output over that time is really staggering, and from the point of view of a columnist today, it's sort of overwhelming. There were some articles, particularly at the beginning, where Maeztu wrote over 300 articles per year, and throughout his time here, he rarely dips below 200 articles a year. So we're talking about over 3,000 in total over the whole time that he was here. So it's a huge corpus of texts. He also wrote a play, he wrote a dense work of political theory, and he wrote about a dozen public lectures. And it's also important, and I think it's one of the reasons why I find him interesting and compelling, that he wrote for a mass audience. I think a lot of earlier accounts of Britain from Spaniards, which are very interesting to scholars, and rightly so, are with rather reduced audiences in mind, so be they letters or books that maybe shared a small distribution, whereas with Maeztu we're talking about newspapers which could at times reach circulations of about 130,000, between 130,000 and 120,000 copies every day. And they also reached audiences across the political spectrum. So one of the newspapers that he wrote for La Correspondencia de España was more targeted towards a conservative audience, whereas Heraldo de Madrid, which he started collaborating with in 1910, was marketed towards a more progressive audience. So it's numerically very significant, I think, this endeavor that he was undertaking in terms of readers. And really, perhaps the best proof of his success was that soon other newspapers started sending their own correspondence here. So he was the first one, but he wasn't the only one for very long. Major figures such as Julio Camba, Luis Araquistain, or Ramon Pérez de Ayala followed in Maeztu's steps and reported from the British capital. And if you're curious about these figures, I can talk about them more in the Q&A session. But another reason why Maeztu is interesting and compelling is that he didn't just report from London, he also became intensely involved in its cultural and its intellectual life. He frequented a number of clubs, he became a voracious reader of British journals and periodicals. He attended rallies and public talks organized by the Fabian Society. Again, not getting much out of them at the beginning, but improving as time went on. And he was a very avid theater goer, and he made a point of going to the plays of George Bernard Shaw on opening night. And he met Shaw, and he greatly admired him, and they had even they exchanged a couple of articles during the war, so they were well acquainted with one another. He also collaborated for a while with one of the great literary and political journals of the time, this journal titled The New Age, in which he published nearly 80 articles and essays. He became a close friend of that journal's editor, Alfred Richard Orridge, and he attended the weekly gatherings that Orridge organized for contributors at the Café Royal. Maeztu also befriended the poet and literary critic T.E. Hume, who was one of the main figures in the avant-garde, which was sort of elbowing for room in Edwardian London. And through him, Hume organized these rather famous meetings at his lover's house in Soho, and they were very well attended by the majority of figures in the avant-garde in London at the time. And Maeztu, we have various records of him attending quite regularly these meetings, and there he would have rubbed shoulders with authors and artists like Ezra Pound, Wyndham Lewis, Jacob Epstein, Rupert Brooke, and Walter Sickert. Maeztu's interest in theology, which increased as the time went by, also led him to join the London Society for the Study of Religion, which was a highly exclusive debating society. Actually, it was a secret debating debating society. You couldn't really join without being proposed by one of the members, and the members, one of the bylaws of the association was to never discuss the existence of the association. I think a theological fight club, as it were. And this was, as I said, a debating society organized by some of the most prominent British theologians of the time. So lots of people who taught and who preached at Oxbridge colleges. In a rather different vein, London was also the place where Maeztu had his two most important sentimental relationships. The first was a rather tempestuous affair with a married British woman, which all Spaniards present in London at the time seemed to have been aware of, because they all wrote about it in their memoirs. It was, I think, one of the most publicized affairs in Edwardian society. And years after that was over, Maeztu met a woman who would become his wife, a British woman by the name of Alice Mabel Hill, who ended up moving to Spain with him when he decided to return. So I hope that what I've been saying so far gives you a sense of the importance and also the intensity of Maeztu's time in Britain. I've been researching Spanish Anglophiles for a while, and I can really think of very few Spanish intellectuals before or since who had such a prolonged stay in the UK and who utilized it with such clear didactic purpose, at least towards the Spanish public. And there's also, I think, a little precedent of a Spaniard who became involved so directly in British cultural life. Again, not just meeting and shaking hands with some of the principal figures of the intellectual scene of the time, but also striking friendships with them, which had important repercussions in his ideology and also in theirs. However, all that I've been saying so far, and all of this picture that I've been painting of Maeztu, actually squares poorly with a couple of facts. And the first is that Maeztu was increasingly critical of Britain in his articles. As the years went on, he presented a country to his Spanish readers that was deeply flawed and which was toying with both imperial decay and social revolution. I'll go more into why he did this in a minute. And the second fact that it scores poorly with is that following his return to Spain in 1919, and as Ignacio mentioned in the introduction, Maeztu became a very important figure in the nationalist right. In fact, in probably his most famous and his most influential book, which is entitled Defensa de la Hispanidad, he makes this definition of what Hispanic identity is, and he's very explicit about saying that it's diametrically opposed to the identity and the values of the English-speaking peoples of the world. So if we are to look at Maeztu's publications rather than at his biography, I think we would find it hard to label him an Anglophile, at least according to the sort of standard view that we have of what these figures are. But that's actually, I think, what I want to delve into for the rest of the talk, and what I think is worth thinking about. What we have with Maeztu is this paradox that it was his deep immersion in the British culture of his time which led him to adopt the hypercritical discourse that many Britons of the time were developing towards their own country. Moreover, it was the influence of British authors which led him to reject the very features of modernity which Britain embodied better than any other Western nation of the time. And in other words, what I'm getting at is that the more successfully anglicized Maeztu became on the intellectual plane, the more he rejected Britain as a country and as a society. So that's the sort of paradox that I wanted to sketch out. I want to look at it in more detail now by looking at the image of the UK that Maeztu put forward during his time here. Just for a little bit of context, as well, most of you will already be aware of it, just to situate us, Maeztu arrives in London in what we now refer to as the Edwardian period, right? So these are the years that go from the death of Queen Victoria in 1901 to the beginning of the First World War in 1914. And we have this, I think, image in our cultural memory of this time as the placid last stage of the long 19th century, the sort of last summer before the upheavals of the 20th, right? We have that very influential formulation by Hobsbawm of the age of extremes, the short 20th century that starts in 1914 and goes until, I guess, 1989. And there's this sense that the long 19th century kind of continues with this very pleasant and sunny summer that is the Edwardian period. But the reality, or the lived reality, of those years was very different. So it's not just that he becomes extremely nationalistic, but also that he becomes quite antagonistic towards Britain and the English-speaking peoples. British life during these years was marked by national anxieties, by an increased tempo of events, and by growing tensions in public discourse. Many of the certainties of the Victorian age, everything from Britain's place in the world, Britain's place as a great world power, to the relationship between the genders, came under attack from various quarters. And it became evident that the country had to change, that it was going to change, but it was very unclear what direction that change would take. As for London itself, by the time of Maeztu's arrival, it was not only one of the largest and most industrialized cities in the world, it had also been shocked by the revelations of mass poverty in many of its neighborhoods, which had been undertaken by social researchers like Charles Booth. And the result of this was a very vigorous reformist movement which sought to tackle the inequalities of industrial society, sometimes by using the tools of modernity, so particularly the Fabian Society advocating that, well, we need to expand the state in order to tackle the inequalities of industrial society, and we need to create more experts that will manage society, but also sometimes by rejecting modernity, by proposing a return to pre-industrial values. And here the figure of William Morris looms, and of John Ruskin loom very large, and I'll talk more about them in a couple of minutes. All of this helps explain Maeztu's recurring portrait of London during his time here as an industrialized, mechanicized, hyperactive, and enormous metropolis. One of his early articles described it thus, I quote, "London, with its endless railroad tracks, with its factories, with its enormous docks by the river, with its cabs, with its automobiles, with its omnibuses, and with the million hatted men who make their way to the city every morning." End quote. But the city's size was a source of disquiet for him. He described London as a monstrous, this was a word that he used very often, monstruosa, agglomeration of various disparate neighborhoods, which together formed, quote, "an old, dirty, ramshackle city," end quote. A year later, he described the general election, and some of you may be familiar, this is the general election of 1910, which takes place in the midst of a constitutional crisis between the House of Commons and the House of Lords. He painted these elections in the most dramatic of terms, quote, "These elections are unique in the whole history of the world. They have no precedent, and indeed they involve the most considerable revolution of any that have so far taken place." End quote. So we can see that the increased tempo of Edwardian public life led Maeztu to present British society as a hyperactive and thoroughly politicized one. He lauded how much electoral activity there was here in comparison with Spain, explaining that politicians canvassed much more than their Spanish counterparts. There was a real effort to galvanize the public into accepting the positions defended by each party. He was also initially very supportive of the policies of the Liberal government led by Asquith and Lloyd George, which, as was mentioned before, set the building blocks of the modern welfare state. And he was also very impressed by the British Labour Party, which of course at that time is starting to pick up steam as one of the important parties of the British left, and eventually will come to replace the Liberal Party as the years go by. And so this led Maeztu to present the UK as a model of success for Spanish progressives. He even wrote various articles and essays proposing that Spanish intellectuals follow the model of George Bernard Shaw, Sidney and Beatrice Webb and the Fabians in their way of viewing the relationship between the intellectuals and society. But it's also very clear from sort of following the various articles that he wrote that with the passing of the years, Maeztu got caught up in the frustrations of a number of Britons at the slow progress of the more revolutionary legislation, or at its final shape when it did get passed. Following the lead of authors like Chesterton or Hilaire Belloc, Maeztu became quite worried that the expansion of the state that the new liberals were advocating was going to backfire, that it was going to reduce the freedom of workers without really leading to a substantial increase in their well-being. And this is something that Hilaire Belloc defended very vigorously in his essay from 1912 entitled The Servile State, and it's something that Maeztu definitely took on board. Maeztu was also dismayed by the Marconi scandal of 1912, which exposed government corruption at the highest level. And so by 1913, so marked that this is the eve of the First World War, Maeztu had come to believe that the British parliamentary system was, and I quote, enthralled to a plutocratic oligarchy, which remains aloof from any ideal other than conserving and increasing its own power. He also came to believe that since the liberal reforms were going to backfire, this was going to lead to a social revolution. And he often said that Britain was inching ever closer to that. So his vision of a country of orderly progress gradually became replaced by that of an aimless nation, one that was inching ever closer towards either a rather bloody revolution or an Orwellian bureaucratic nightmare. Maeztu's presentation of Edwardian London also devoted quite a bit of attention to British women, and this was particularly in the attention that he paid to the move for the female suffrage. So as is well known, the early years of the century had seen increasing action by associations that advocated the right of British women to vote in national elections. If you've seen the film Suffragettes from a couple of years ago, bear in mind that's the London that Maeztu is living in. So he's seeing these demonstrations, and he's seeing all of these actions, and he's seeing this very wide-ranging public debate in Edwardian society about this topic. Maeztu reported very frequently on the demonstrations organized by the women's franchise groups and on the bills which were put forward in Parliament on this issue. And his reporting really bears witness to the fact that, yes, this was a topic that was very hotly debated in Edwardian society, but it was also interesting for a Spaniard in that it seemed nationally peculiar, in the sense that we have to remember that the Spanish feminist movement at this time is much less well organized, much less effectively organized than the British one. It's much less vigorous and has picked up a lot less steam. So for a Spaniard at the time, this pressure by British women for the vote almost seems like a national particularity. He even wrote in 1908 that suffragism, and I quote, "for now seems like a movement that is confined to England," end quote. As for his own position on the issue, Maeztu was originally against granting women the vote, not for the reasons that we might think. One of the sort of discoveries that I made when I was doing this research was that actually there were a lot of British progressives who were against giving women the vote, because there was this sort of myth that was very deeply ingrained in the minds of a lot of people that women were inherently more conservative than men, and if you gave women the vote, they would vote for the Conservative Party, and the Conservative Party would always win. And there were liberal politicians like Asquith, particularly, who didn't want to take that gamble. And you see Maeztu referring in a couple of local elections, once women get the vote, at least at the local level, when these yield conservative majorities, Maeztu even says, see, this is what women will do with the vote. He also has this interesting interpretation where he sees the agitation of British women for the vote as a symptom of unease with contemporary capitalism. He says that actually, what this shows is that capitalist society is destroying the balance between men and women. And in one of his articles, he told a sort of imaginary feminist that he was having a dialogue with, quote, "Men, society, capitalism are throwing you out into the streets by the millions to try and make a living. This is terrible, but it is not merely a feminist issue, but a social one," end quote. But of course, Maeztu wavers quite explicitly on this issue, and in an article in 1908, he argued that women had a right to be educated and to be granted the same political rights as men. And here one suspects that the influence of his sister, who was at the time becoming very prominent as a pedagogue in Madrid, had quite a bit to do with his understanding of the role of women in society. So Maeztu, as I was saying, wavers on this issue of the female franchise. But the issue that he wavers on the most, where you see the most instability throughout his time here, is the question of British national power. And again, I think it's helpful to remember that by the time Maeztu arrives here, the UK has the largest empire in the world and exercises something very close to world hegemony. And it's very clear that this colored the image of Britain that was held abroad, especially in countries which had seen their empires dwindle, as was the Spanish case. But the rise of foreign powers, such as Germany, Russia, or the United States, and the near disaster in colonial conflicts like the Boer War, had led to a very intense debate within Britain over whether the country's days as the great world power were over or were coming to an end. Maeztu was very interested on this issue. He reported on it a lot, but he seems never to have fully resolved this tension between how Britain was still perceived abroad and how it was viewed here. So the view from abroad of Britain as the great world power, from which all other countries feel a certain apprehension, and the view here that this is actually all coming to an end. There's this great national anxiety over what one scholar called relative decline. So in some articles, Maeztu would declare that it was a decadent country, well beyond the zenith of its power. Well, in some others, he wrote that the UK remained as mighty as ever, particularly when he seems to have thought that British progressives were winning, in a way. Following the approval of one of Lloyd George's reforms, for example, he wrote, and I quote, "England is not in decay. She is richer, more intelligent, and more moral than ever before. England has never worked so much, has never thought with such intensity, and her public administration has never been so excellent." End quote. By the way, I keep saying England, and it's because Maeztu did this constant sliding that is very common in the Spanish-speaking world, between talking about the UK but saying Inglaterra, so taking the part for the whole. And I think this is something that we see constantly today as well. This constantly saying Inglaterra when you're really referring to the political entity of the United Kingdom. So in this context, it's not surprising to find inconsistencies in Maeztu's presentation of English national character, that sort of holy grail which every visitor or correspondent to London tried to find, to discover, and then convey to his readers. Again, let's keep in mind this is a time when people believe that every country has a sort of national spirit, a national essence, a certain national way of being, and part of the job of foreign correspondents is to find out what that is and explain it to their audiences. Throughout Maeztu's corpus of London articles, we find great variability in the qualities that he believes are representative and constitutive of Englishness. And he himself seemed to be aware of this. In one article he wrote, quote, "Once upon a time, I, as a Spaniard, envied England the power of her fleet. Later, the richness of its coal mines. Later still, the integrity of its judiciary. And, at least yesterday, the idealism of its artists." End quote. So there's this kind of sense that he himself notices that there's various things that he finds representative of Britain, and that he decides to fixate on at different moments. In yet another article, he argued that England was the country of Puritanism, but this is what really set England apart from other countries. But a few lines later in that same article, he said that what actually set England apart was monetary common sense, that this was a country of economists and of pragmatism. Indeed, one way to view Maeztu's corpus of London articles is as a lengthy and scattershot attempt at positivistic explanation, one that fixes the idea of England upon a variety of symbols that really depend on what it is that has caught his eye that day. And if we look at the work of other foreign correspondents that came after him, it's very clear that they follow the same pattern. Indeed, one way to view Maeztu's corpus of London articles is as a lengthy and scattershot attempt at positivistic explanation, one that fixes the idea of England upon a variety of symbols that really depend on what it is that has caught his eye that day. And if we look at the work of other foreign correspondents that came after him, it's very clear that they follow the same pattern. So this is pretty much the story up until 1913, and then everything changes once the First World War begins. Despite his pre-war criticism of his host country, Maeztu was from the very beginning, from day one, a staunch defender of the Allies and of Britain in particular. He was one of the promoters and of the signatories of the Spanish pro-Allied manifesto. He wrote copiously about the war and the effects that it was having on his host country. And he was sent to the front at least 5 times by the various newspapers that he worked for. He also worked with and for the British propaganda services, writing prologues for the Spanish translations of anti-German tracts, and penning a highly partisan memoir of his time at the Western Front. And I think it's worth clarifying. One says, one talks about a journalist working with propaganda services, and in today's mindset that sounds terrible, but at least from all of the things that I've read and all of the research that I've done, it's very clear that Maeztu was not a pen for hire. It's very clear that he was very heartily committed to the British cause in the war, that he lent himself to collaborating in any way that he could with helping the country that he felt should win the war to win it. And again, this was not unusual among Spanish intellectuals of the time. Authors like Luis Araquistain or Ramón Pérez de Ayala capitalized on the fact that their pro-Allied opinions were very useful, of course, to the British and French governments in order to shore up their ever precarious economic situation. So, this being the general situation, Maeztu's presentation of the UK was exclusively positive during his final years in London. He constantly uses this metaphor. He doesn't really disavow his pre-war criticism, but he uses this metaphor of a great national regeneration. So everything that he said was wrong with Britain before the war was true, but the war was changing it. The war was helping Britain overcome its problems. He wrote that the country's ills were being washed away with the blood, sweat, and tears of the struggle. And he wrote that the altruism fostered by the war had put an end to the culture of luxury and wastefulness which he had been denouncing. He claimed that poverty had practically disappeared thanks to the government's decisiveness in putting people to work in wartime industries. And he wrote rapturously about the British Army. His reporting from the trenches painted British soldiers as paragons of individualism and understatedness, as fervent sportsmen who carried a penchant for gardening in their heart. He argued that the dexterity of English troops in throwing hand grenades was a direct result of their love for cricket. And he claimed that they were, I quote, all courage, bravery, impetuousness, and tenacity towards the enemy, but all courtesy and sympathy and compassion for their own and their friends. End quote. It's easy to smirk at these sentences, and I do when reading them and when writing them down. But again, I think it's worth putting them into context, and again, not just into a Spanish pro-Allied context, but also the British context of his time. Maeztu knew full well the costs and the horrors of war. This is also very clear from his reporting. He visited a lot of field hospitals. He saw a lot of soldiers who had lost limbs in the trenches, and his good friend, probably his best friend, The poet I mentioned earlier, T. Hume, died in action, was killed in action in 1917. He was aware of what was going on, but like most Britons of the time, he was compelled by the urgency of the situation and by the very polarizing mindset fostered by the war to create a simplified vision of the UK in contrast to an equally simplified vision of the Germans. His reporting, I think, is very interesting to set it side by side with the works of authors like Arnold Bennett, Ford Madox Ford, or G.K. Chesterton during these years. I mean, Chesterton has a book entitled, I believe, The Barbarism of Berlin. So this is very much the cultural milieu during the war. Indeed, Maeztu could very well have written the sentences I'm about to read out, which were written after the war by one of the main British correspondents, a man called Philip Gibbs, and he wrote, looking back on his reporting, "We identified ourselves absolutely with the armies on the fields, and we wiped out of our minds all thought of personal scoops and all temptation to write one word which would make the task of officers and men more difficult or dangerous. There was no need for censorship of our dispatches. We were our own censors." So, coming now to the end of the talk, Maeztu returns to Spain shortly after the end of the war, putting an end to his 15-year stint as a foreign correspondent. And his later trajectory, as mentioned before, was primarily linked to conservative thought and increasingly to Spanish nationalism. And this has led researchers during the second half of the 20th century particularly to construct this narrative whereby Maeztu, upon reaching a mature age, would have realized the error of his Anglophile ways and focused solely on Spain and its traditions. But this account is problematic for a number of reasons. The first, and as we've just seen, Maeztu was at the very least a very highly peculiar Anglophile, even during his time in Britain. And also, Britain, rather than sort of disappearing from his later work, actually is a constantly recurring presence in his mature writings. During the 20s and 30s, he often posed Britain, and he wrote about Britain as a sort of cautionary tale of industrial and liberal modernity, referring often to the social ills which he argued were being caused by the failures of English liberalism. He blamed thinkers like John Stuart Mill and Bertrand Russell for the fact that, quote, "England is currently one of the countries most immediately threatened by social revolution," end quote. And this is also in the context of the general strike in the 1920s and the severe economic problems and social tensions that were happening in Britain during the interwar period. But again, I keep returning to this, these opinions were decisively shaped by Maeztu's proximity to certain sectors of British culture. So when he writes against Bertrand Russell, we know, for example, that his friend T. Hume also despised Russell. And in fact, we know that when Maeztu was still in London and Hume was still alive, they both went to a public talk, to a public lecture by Russell, and they actually subjected him to a very hostile questioning during the Q&A session. So this brings us to the crucial point. The reasons for Maeztu's turning to Spanish tradition were British in origin. During his final years in London, Maeztu had come into contact with various thinkers and writers who rejected the main features of modernity as they saw it. And as they saw it, these features were secularization, internationalism, industrial capitalism, the expansion of the state, and a greater tolerance of free speech and political liberty. These new British medievalists, and I call them medievalists because they often vindicated the model of the Middle Ages and the way that industry was organized through the guilds, and the way that they thought that power was decentralized in small communities, and there was this sort of joy in creating art and in building cathedrals and all this and all that. These new British medievalists drank from the ideas of John Ruskin and William Morris, as well as from those of the Oxford movement. And over time, they developed a sort of anti-capitalist Catholicism, which in a place like Edwardian Britain, I think it's worth keeping in mind that it was about as anti-establishment as you could be situating yourself. And their rejection of industrialized modernity really stayed with Maeztu for the rest of his career. And it led him, crucially, to develop an appreciation of those nations with a tense relationship with modernity, such as his own Spain. And it led him to reject those countries which were built as the great reference of modernity, such as the Britain he had spent so many years in. Even, again, Maeztu's formulation of Hispanic identity in Defensa de la Hispanidad, we actually see that drinks a lot from the criticisms that a lot of Britons were developing towards their own empire. Again, bear in mind that these are the years when nationalist unrest in Ireland is increasing. Also in India, Gandhi is becoming a very well-known figure throughout Europe. So there's this sense that there's a lot of Britons that look at the empire and say we've taken a wrong turn somewhere, this is not working, the values that have sort of inspired our empire up until now need to be reformulated, and Maeztu drinks from these ideas and uses them in his own writings. So, to conclude, I think that Maeztu's career and his intellectual trajectory encourage us to differentiate between two processes that we often lump together. The first of these processes is the image that we form of other countries, particularly when these images involve an important element of desire or of rejection. This process is often predicated on the distance at which that image is formed, and it's very clear that it often suffers from important tensions when that distance is either reduced or increased. And the second process is this international commerce of ideas, which has always been very fluid, particularly in Western Europe, and which sometimes, not always, and maybe not even very often, but sometimes operates on a nationally blind basis. And what I mean by that is that sometimes, for some reason, there's you read the authors of a foreign country, and if you agree with their ideas, then you consider yourself as an admirer of that country. You consider them representatives of that national culture, and you slide very easily from admiration for certain authors to admiration for their home country. But other times it doesn't work that way, and it's very clear with Maeztu that it didn't with a number of authors. So he could be very successfully influenced by certain authors without thinking that made him an Anglophile. And this is very sort of, we can see how this works with authors who are particularly critical of their home country. So sometimes when I explain this, I make a comparison with somebody today like the Guardian columnist Owen Jones, who I assume many of you will be familiar with. So you read Owen Jones' books in Spain, which are fairly widely read in certain sectors of the Spanish left. And of course, if you read those books, you won't get a good impression of contemporary England. You get an impression that contemporary England is hell, where workers' conditions continue to diminish, etc., etc. But if you read that and you become influenced by his diagnoses and his prescriptions, then you are becoming influenced by British ideas and British debates, which are formed in a particularly British context. So this paradox, I think, doesn't just happen in Maeztu's case. It actually is more prevalent than we tend to think. So again, Maeztu was probably the most anglicized author of his time, but the types of ideas that he absorbed from Britain led him and his readers, both then and since, to fail to notice the national origins of his ideas. So at a local level, and I promise that this is the final paragraph. At a local level, I think we can conclude, and this is something that at least for me was quite energizing as a researcher, that British intellectual influence abroad has been stronger and much more varied than we tend to make concessions for, or that we tend to assume. We tend to take it as a fact that when Britain has exerted cultural and intellectual influence abroad, it has been in sectors that we associate with classical liberalism, when clearly it has been through other areas of its thought and its culture as well. And at the more general level, I think we can take note of the fact that international cultural transfers and borrowings take many different forms. They follow intensely complicated dynamics, that they have always been very intense among the nations of Western Europe, and that they have existed, they exist, and they will continue to exist, even when we want to believe that they do not, even when we do things to prevent them from happening. Thank you for your time.
So now it's the time for questions and answers, and I myself have a question to you. There seems to be, correct me if I'm wrong, a strong tradition in the Spanish right that rejects everything, anything related with all things British. But there also seems to be a strong Anglophile tradition in the Spanish right. How can one make sense of that? Or how does one explain that?
Yeah. I think there's, well, you can hear me, right, at the end? Or
another way.
Yeah, no, that's very, it's a fascinating question, and one that I keep coming back to. There's two quick answers, I think, to it. The first one is, of course, the Siglo de Oro, the Golden Age, and this idea of this historical enmity between Spain and its empire and the UK, and of course the Armada, this idea of the historical opposition between the two countries and between two imperial powers. I think that's kind of also very seared into the memory of the cultural memory of sectors that vindicate that aspect of Spanish history. So I think that explains the animosity in one sense. As for the culturally Anglophile element that you mentioned, I think the answer there is Edmund Burke. I mean, I think Burke was very widely read in Spain following the French Revolution, and of course the War of Independence against Napoleonic troops. There's a couple of researchers that have talked about how Burke sort of becomes the anti-Rousseau, and this is not just in terms of conservatism versus liberalism, but also in the sense of the bad foreign thinker, who is the French thinker, of course, from the country that is invading us, to the good foreign thinker, the person who, from the country that is aiding us in this war of national liberation. And I think that the influence of Burke is very strong. You see it really throughout the Spanish right of the past 2 centuries. It's and again, it's an influence that takes various different forms. It can focus solely on the negative view of the French Revolution and all the traditions that stem from it, or it can take the form of a vindication of a more civilized gradualist liberalism. So in that sense, it's an influence that you can see it in sectors closer to the center and also sectors closer to the more hardline right.
Excellent, thank you very much. Are there any questions?
First of all, thank you very much. That was really, really very good. I got actually 2 questions. One very quick one is that did he ever go back to England, to the UK? The second one is, do you have any? Do you know what was the actual impact of his writings in the Spanish society at the time, in terms of the Anglophilia in Spain through that period?
Yeah.
In the war.
Yeah. In terms of the return, the answer is easy. He came back. We know of 2 times that he came back. One in the mid-20s, and the other one in I think in 1933. Both of the times it seems. So his son was born here, and they moved to Spain when he was, I think, a year or 2 years old. And I think part of it was also so that his wife would see the family again. I say this because he didn't write about those trips. He didn't say anything about, he didn't write any articles about, which would of course have been very useful for me, any articles where he talked about sort of what he remembered about Britain and how he saw it in the 20s and 30s. But he seems to have viewed these visits as family visits, and there wasn't a real journalistic interest on his part about them. In terms of the impact, it's something again that I've struggled with a lot in my research, because so today if I want to look at the impact that a certain article has had, then it's easy. I just look at the online comments or what's been said on Twitter about it or anything. Like there's a textual trace to the impact or to the reaction. We don't really have that for print culture, for at least newspaper culture of the early 20th century, at least not in a very direct way. So what I can see are rather indirect forms of influence. So for example, Maeztu wrote a lot about George Bernard Shaw, and a little after he did that, Shaw's plays started to be translated into Spanish, and one of the translators said that one of the first notices he had of Shaw was through one of Maeztu's articles. So there we can see the link quite directly. Other elements, we know that his book, his memoir of his time in the trenches during the First World War, sold very well, and it was actually aided by sort of colonies of British expats that were throughout the Spanish territory that were also collaborating with the Foreign Office. So we know at least that was read and that people were interested in it. When he was advocating the Fabian Society as a model, we see that a couple of years after he starts to do that, there's a sort of news item in one of the newspapers they wrote for, saying that there's been a Spanish Fabian Society that's been formed. And Ortega Gasset is involved in that element. It was very short-lived, but I think we can see elements of influence there. And finally, and this is a bit more tenuous, right? This is my speculation. But when you look at so we have this image of the intellectual generations in Spain at the time. So we have the generation of 1898, then we have the generation of 1914, then 1927. The way, and you don't have to agree, and I don't agree that these are useful ways of dividing intellectual life, but what's interesting for me is that the people of the so-called generation of 1914 follow ways of intervention in public debate that are very similar to the Fabian Society. They are very similar to the things that Maeztu was proposing at the time that Spanish intellectuals needed to do. And I'm not sure that's a coincidence. We think that Ortega Gasset was a very good friend of Maeztu's, and actually for a number of years Maeztu had exerted this sort of mentor role over Ortega Gasset. I think we are safe to assume that some of the ideas of what he was saying that were the successes of British intellectuals in their own society, that Ortega Gasset drank some of those ideas and also operated in accordance with them.
Thank you very much.
Hello, thank you very much for your talk. I think it was very interesting. My question relates to my fascination about Maeztu, that it's related to him changing his view and his position, political position over time, I understand, right? So he starts embracing labor and the changes in the modernity, and then he rejects it. And then when he comes back to Spain, he starts political life that is very much conservative. So my question to you will be, how do you relate this to the British critical thinking, if I may, because it doesn't seem a pattern that it relates very much to the Spanish intellectuals?
Yeah, no, thank you for your question. I mean, I think it's the question that anybody who approaches Maeztu's figure has to grapple with, and I'm not sure that I have a perfect answer, but anti-capitalism is curious in the sense that if you see capitalism as a product of modernity, then you can see how a lot of people in Britain at the time, and through them Maeztu, made this jump from, well, if we don't like contemporary capitalism and capitalism is a product of modernity, then clearly the answer is to return to pre-modern values. And then you fix it on, okay, so what's pre-modern, right? Where did we start to go wrong? And the people that he's reading create this sense of, okay, we started going wrong in the Middle Ages. Also bear in mind that these are the years when Max Weber is creating this very influential narrative of capitalism is the product of Protestantism, and there's people in the UK who are thinking that as well, and say, okay, well, if the Middle Ages is when everything was right, what's distinctive about the Middle Ages? Well, that everybody was Catholic. So then this means that clearly this is something that we need to return to. So this, I don't know. I mean, this is how I've sort of explained to myself how the change happens. I think Maeztu was very earnest. I mean, to a certain extent, one of the main criticisms that were sort of thrown at him was that he was humorless, and I think that speaks to the fact that he really was trying to make sense of the world that he was living in, and he really believed the things that he was saying. And because he was intellectually earnest, when somebody convinced him of a position, then he embraced that position, and he was like, okay, well, I was wrong, and then this is clearly now what I need to defend, and this new view that I've just adopted is what I need to defend from now on. So I think temperamentally he was predisposed towards changing his mind, but I think in a very honest way, in an earnest way. So I don't think there's any cynicism or any self-interest that happens, and that is a part of his intellectual change. Also, again, you compare the trajectories of Maeztu and somebody like Chesterton. It's interesting that you see them reacting to events in the 20s and 30s in a very similar way. So because they both have this increasing espousal of medievalist Catholicism and this rejection of modernity, the two of them are initially attracted by fascism, at least by Mussolini, in that they read it as this kind of resurrection of the Catholic world, and creating a model against sort of Protestant liberalism. And then once Hitler comes into the scene, they reject that quite clearly and quite strongly. So in a way, it's a good kind of sort of test for who has influenced him the most. While the British thinkers who react to the same events in the same way that he does are a good litmus test in that sense. Does that answer your?
Excellent. Thank you. I really appreciated that presentation. Incidentally, I think that the mot juste you're looking for just then in relation to Chesterton is distributism, isn't it? It's the anti-capitalist but also anti-socialist impulse of romantically minded Catholics who are anti-capitalist on the one hand for the reasons that you spelled out, but who would agree with the view of somebody like Gladstone that humankind will not be regenerated by the state. It's the little platoons, to cite an expression of Burke. There was one thing I thought you left hanging slightly, because you said that he became more and more interested in religion, but you didn't mention his affiliation, and I wondered if you could say a bit more about that. I mean, did he remain a devout Catholic all through his life? Incidentally, it strikes me, for what it's worth, that a Spanish observer of the UK, small c conservative, perhaps Catholic, might see all sorts of things about this country, on the one hand, to make them give them an attack of the vapors, things that they would see as slightly hair-raising, obviously beginning with the Reformation and with England's application to itself of all the language of Israel from the Old Testament. So all the things that America believes about itself now were things that England once thought about itself. And I don't suppose there would have been much of a British Empire had it not been for the Reformation and the idea that Protestantism needed to be exported to the ends of the earth. On the other hand, this putative Spanish observer might see, on the more positive side, something distinctly Catholic, quote unquote, about the British political setup. It's an irony, isn't it, that whereas there is something distinctly Protestant about, let's say, the French Constitution, which is a text set in stone to which people refer in the way that Protestants might go back to the Bible, purging themselves of all tradition. Whereas we in this country, in our very pragmatic, not to say fudge-like way, we don't even have a constitution. I mean, we just have an accretion of tradition going back a millennium. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, thank you. Those were all very good points. I guess the ones that I can comment on the most, and this actually attests to the earlier question. Something that I wanted to mention is the way that we write intellectual history sometimes goes against our own interests, and we sometimes defeat ourselves in the sense of we have a sense of who won the intellectual battles of each time, and we tend to write history backwards in that sense. And sometimes when we see figures that didn't win, we tend to treat them as on the fringe, and we kind of tend to see them as rather unimportant. But of course, at the time they weren't. They weren't that way, and they didn't seem to observers at the time. So now we know who won the sort of battles in the British left of the 1900s and 1910s, or who won the sort of battle for criticizing contemporary capitalism. We know that the Labour Party ended up winning an election. We know that it ended up forming government. We know that the New Statesman ended up, selling more copies than the New Age. But at the time, not everybody knew that that's how it was going to happen, and that's definitely what happens with distributism, as you were mentioning. And this is absolutely the movement that Maeztu was drawn to during his the final stages of his time here. And he's, I think, one of the first ones to write about it in Spain, and he definitely has a few articles about it. But again, he doesn't see it as a movement that's nationally peculiar. And because distributivism has this emphasis, or at least some of its proponents dovetail their prescriptions with those for a kind of Catholic Renaissance, Maeztu doesn't see it as representative of Britain. He actually sees it as something that's vindicating the Latin world, as it were. In terms of the religious question, again, Maeztu is fascinating because he follows very long ways of returning to places where a lot of Spaniards would have started at. So he was very fiercely anti-clerical when he was, and he drank a lot from the 19th century Republican tradition during his youth. And he does not think that really religion has much of a role to play in creating a modern society. But when he arrives here, he writes in the kind of the tail end of the modernist controversy, and it's in this kind of controversy within the Catholic Church over, well, I guess how you read scripture and how what you believe about faith and about dogma and about questioning, sort of about creating your own readings of religious texts. And that interests him a lot. It interests him from the sense of maybe this is a Catholicism that I can be interested in, from a philosophical perspective and also from the type of society that it can create. So when he initially starts going to the meetings of the London Society for the Study of Religion, I don't get the sense that he's going there as a Catholic. I get the sense that he's going there as somebody who's interested in religion and religious debate as a kind of sub-sector of philosophical debate, and as a way of also looking at, okay, well, religion is also a way of structuring society and structuring the relationships between individuals and between, if we want, individuals and the state and individuals and their neighbors. This is interesting. How can I work this into my political philosophy? And over time, then he starts fitting the mold more of a more recognizable Spanish Catholicism. But it's also worth saying that the book that he wrote when he was here, Authority, Liberty, and Function in the Light of the War, when it was which has a strong theological component, when it was translated into Spanish, a lot of Spanish Catholics hated it, and actually there was a couple of articles by bishops saying that, by Spanish bishops, the Bishop of Granada particularly, who said that this book doesn't make any sense. It doesn't. It is so at odds with the way that religion was presented at the time, and the way that the relationship between sort of God and man was conceived or was being diffused here at the time. So other people saw it as a foreign import, even if he didn't. That was a long way of responding to your comments.
Thank you for your talk. It's been really enlightening. And I've got two questions for you. One is, during the period where Maeztu was living in London, Britain, did he show, because you are talking about Maeztu showing the reality of Britain towards Spain, but did he do the other way around? Did he go to write about Spain within Britain? Was he, perhaps, did you come across any, critical views of him towards the political reality of Spain and the monarchy, situation of the monarchy? And my second question is, you were mentioning that he was well acquainted with the intellectual intellectuals in Britain or in London, but I'm aware that there was also a small community of aristocrats, perhaps related in connection with the Spanish monarchy, that perhaps were influencers within the British society and well embedded in the social life here. I was wondering if you came across what was his relation with this community and if he showed any views as well in terms of that relationship.
Sure. No, thank you. Those very pertinent questions. So as I mentioned at the beginning, Maeztu collaborates with this journal, the New Age, and he writes about 80 pieces for it, and it's mostly during the war years. And what's interesting is that in those pieces, some of which end up making their way to his book, to An Authority, Liberty and Function, he never writes about Spain. In fact, if you didn't look at the surname of the person, and the first name of the person who was writing those articles, there's very little indication that this has been written by a Spaniard. He never uses Spain as a way to illustrate a point. He's really, I think when he's writing for a British audience, he's presenting himself, or he thinks of himself as this kind of cosmopolitan figure who is very well embedded in British debates and wants to participate in British debates and wants to address a British audience on its own terms, and has very little interest in sort of explaining Spain to Britons. We can speculate about why that would be. I mean, it's true that he was participating in fairly high-flying, and by that I mean very long sentences and very arid paragraphs, political debates, and maybe he thought that it was more effective to just be speaking to a British audience as one of them in a way. So the short answer is no. He doesn't really do much to put forward a view of Spain while here. As for the Spaniards that he interacted with when he was here, Maeztu is difficult to research because he doesn't have he has this incredible output, but it's all public, right? So all of his articles are in libraries, and that's easily searchable. But none of his diaries, if he ever kept them, or really much of his correspondence survived, and we suspect that it didn't survive the Civil War. So when we try to reconstruct his life here and who he interacted with on a social basis, we either have to look at the very few letters that survive, which are those which he wrote to Ortega y Gasset or to his sister, and there we're talking about maybe 10 letters each, so it's not a very large archive, and or the references that people have left in their memoirs, people that we know passed through here, and then maybe we go through their memoirs and we find references to him. And in that context, I haven't really found many references to the sort of the group or the milieu that you mentioned. People of course, writers leave much more of a textual trace of what they do with their lives. So there's Pérez de Ayala, who was here at the time, writes about some of his interactions with Maeztu and even has a kind of caricature of him in one of his of his novels. So we know that, and that's easy to reconstruct. People who didn't write for the public, that's harder to see, and it's a kind of needle in a haystack search that that can be quite time-consuming, and at least I haven't been able to undertake yet.
Thank you. It was a great talk. Just a quick question. I was wondering, after all your research about Maeztu, to which extent he was exposed to, he became familiar with all the economic thinking that was developing in that period in Britain. I think it was in the late 1890s that Alfred Marshall published Principles of Economics. Simi and Beatrice Webb founded the London School of Economics. And economics was becoming not a qualitative, moral philosophy field, but actually a science that had metrics, quantum, and policy. And to which extent he became familiar with these ideas, he found them maybe another expression of that modernity that he was skeptical of, or he saw some merit and usefulness.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I am particularly dim for everything related to economics, so this is an element that I know there's more work to be done, and I haven't done as much as if I understood those texts better. But what I can answer is that Maeztu is very drawn to the Fabians. You know, you mentioned Sidney and Beatrice Webb and founding the London School of Economics, and that's very much part of this sense of being factual about the way that you solve the modern world and gas and water socialism and all that stuff. And Maeztu is initially very drawn to that, more as a way to, again, think of how the intellectual can affect society, rather than necessarily as a way to conduct research. I think that's secondary for him. So I think he's generally attracted to it without being very specifically drawn to it. There's also, during the interwar period, he reads a work by J.A. Hobson. The title of this work escapes me now, but it's an explanation of economic crises and how economic crises work. And it influences his own reading of why the Great Depression happens and why the sort of the British economic slump of the 20s and then the Great Depression takes place. Partially because those views, the views that Hobson was defending there, were useful to his overall for his overall mindset. But that's, I think, the more direct influence that I can detect. And as far as I can see, Hobson was kind of a odd figure, or at least I don't find a very clear attachment within the British intelligentsia of the time. That's my stab at an answer.
There's still time for a question before going to the pub. Okay, then we're going to the pub. Thank you very much.
Thank you.